I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I must say I'm also delighted to see so many philosophers in one room, in one space. I know there are a lot of jokes I could make about that. I don't think this is the time to do so, but let me say welcome to our overseas guests, to our distinguished people invited, both Māori and Pākehā. I say kia ora tātou. Wonderful call this morning. Thank you very much for that terrific Georgina and others. Graham Smith, an old friend going back a long way. I must say it's delightful to see you all here, some close friends, some new people, and people from all corners of the globe, if I can use that hackneyed expression. But I'm really pleased that we can really begin to engage with each other's ideas and so on. I'm also going to start here. This is an example of how many concepts you can get into one title. Postcolonial Biopolitics of the Empire of Capital, right? I thought about really teasing it out a wee bit, but it does explain what I want to do, which is, first of all, to honour Professor Jim Marshall, who is our Pākehā kaumātua, and Graham, having lunch with Graham, he did say that Jim was a model of a kind of postcoloniality which was sort of like resistance through enactment, which is something that really does begin to explain, I think, the confluence between Māori studies and postcoloniality in New Zealand, especially through Awanuiare. So, really, let me summarise it very quickly, because I'm going to be talking about three interpretations. After I talked about Jim as a personal mentor, somebody who supervised my PhD, and many people in this room, I won't mention their names. Oh yes, I will. Tina, Elizabeth, Tina Ingleswell, a whole range of people. Richard Herod, he's doing his PhD. Nesta, Ruth Urban, a whole range of people. I think he probably had a hand in Graham's and Linda's as well. And I know that there's some very, very interesting philosophical discussions that went on there. After the introduction to Jim and the acknowledgement to Jim, and may I say this, that at Auckland University, us Pākehā do not know how to honour our forebears, intellectual forebears. I couldn't find a photograph, I couldn't actually find a mention of Jim there, which I think is an extraordinary kind of situation. If we're talking about memory, if we're talking about the ability to honour a scholar who has made a lifetime contribution. And Nolene would know about this as well. I mean, we need to learn from Māori about how we can acknowledge our elders, our scholars, and our forebears. So the three lines of Foucauldian inquiry I'm going to be following. One is Edward Said, postcoloniality. The second is Agamben, and the biopolitics, biopower. And the third is Antonio Negri and Michael Hart on the Empire of Capital. Three, I think, contemporary versions of the appropriation and use of Foucault and Foucauldian concepts. And I want to talk about that in relation to educational studies. And then at the end, if I have a little bit of time, I really do also want to contest those three interpretations and provide something of my own, can I use the word indigenous, interpretation from New Zealand, which is, as I explained to my American colleagues, a little archipelago of 3,000 islands off the coast of Antarctica. They say, we're protected UN country preserved for the breeding of yellow-eyed penguins, and that includes the Pākehā Māori as well. So without further ado, let me start here by retrieving a photograph of Jim from our archive actually. This is Jim Marshall, Professor JD, with whom I worked for a long time, and this is the Marshall Lecture. So I did invite Jim down here, and he was very keen. He's unwell at the moment today, so he's not able to make it, but he does send his greetings. And he was a very lively member of the society, as Peter said. He was president on a couple of occasions and contributed very strongly to the journal. Can you hear me over there? Is that okay? All right, thank you. So let me say here, this was the profile that was established in his capacity as a emeritus professor at University of North Carolina, where he held a position. You see, he was Dean at the University of Auckland, actually a man from the Navy. He studied philosophy at Bristol University under Stefan Kerner, and his thesis was actually on logical identity theory. You know, A equals A. You could write a whole thesis on that, apparently. So he taught mathematics, served as a naval officer, and met his wife Bridget in Bristol, and they settled back in New Zealand. He quickly became dean, and he had a strong involvement with Māori, with Linda and Graham Smith, and a range of other organisations. This is the profile at North Carolina, I should say. He is renowned for a special issue, a Festschrift on scholarship, which is in educational philosophy and theory. Perhaps I can show you that. I've said pretty well all there is to say from that little paragraph. But this is the work of post-foundationalist themes in the philosophy of education. Here he marries, I think, it does show his ability to cover a lot of ground, because he was very interested in policy. He was a stern critic of neoliberalism from its inauguration in the early 80s in New Zealand, particularly the way it restructured education. He also was one of the few people, I think, in philosophy of education who were interested in the relationship between Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Michel Foucault. You might say that these two are extraordinarily different, and they are. But Jim, along with one or two others in the world, has managed to find some connections between them. And I guess I share the same kind of view as Jim in relation to that. This was a paper in the Festschrift that I wrote called Marshalling the Self, James D. Marshall as Educational Philosopher. And it does record the fact that we had quite a special relationship. I feel honoured to give this lecture in his honour. He wasn't like a lot of other academics that I've met. He never professed to understand something we hadn't read. He never bluffed his way. He was a slow reader, strongly analytical, and he never tried to bluff his way. In the neoliberal knowledge economy now, there's a strong tendency to encourage that kind of bluffing nature. And I think that I was very lucky. I was doing a philosophy degree at Auckland, and I did a couple of papers with him. As a master's student, decided that he, rather than people in the philosophy department at Auckland at that point, would be better to supervise a thesis on the later Wittgenstein, which I found, we worked in a capacity, in the old days, we sat next to each other and we'd take time to write a paragraph each, and we'd swap over and so on. Sometimes he would tell me what to write, and sometimes I'd tell him what to write, and I think I was very privileged. I learned a lot in that close kind of tutory relationship. So, he wrote this, I think, well-received book, Michel Foucault, Personal Autonomy in Education, back in 1996, which was really a book that explored the critique that Foucault provided of liberal education. He, particularly around the notion of the autonomous individual or personal autonomy. And he used this in applications to his critique of neoliberalism, where he used the term "bizno power," and he talked about the radical individualist conception that neoliberalism draws upon for the rational, autonomous chooser in the marketplace, and he developed that conceptual critique out of Foucault. So, as he says, this is Marshall, for Foucault, the point of philosophy, insofar as he classified himself as a philosopher, was that philosophy was concerned with the self and involved working on the self. And you know, one of the things that appealed to Jim was this, I think, very deep kind of understanding of transformation of self as an educational project. And he spent quite a lot of time, I think, also psychoanalyzing himself, actually, as we all do, and self-editorializing and so on. A very complex individual, and somebody that I think I ended up writing 9 books and 35 papers with him over the period of our relationship where we were at University of Auckland. So, let me say thank you, Jim. You've done a grand job. You have spawned a whole generation of critical thinkers in New Zealand, particularly in society, and we're very grateful to you. And if I can record this in his absence, you know, a statement about how dearly we think of him. So, let me move to the substance. That's the eulogy. Let me move to the substance of the talk now about this fellow, Michel Foucault. So, I'm really going to follow, you know, one synoptic take on Foucault. It's impossible to do what I want to do in this lecture. This is an impossible lecture to give on Foucault, in the sense that I'm trying to talk about the post-colonial biopower and biopolitic and the empire capital, and you know, one unless really now radically less than an hour. But let me say, here's the starting point. The post-colonial taken from Ibn Said, whose book Orientalism was published in 1978. He's been criticised for being too Foucauldian or not Foucauldian enough, but let me say, really the entry of Foucault into post-colonial studies came from the effect that Foucault had on Ibn Said. And this is what Said says in an interview back in '76, 2 years before the publication of Orientalism. You know, he shows the struggle, how the struggle for domination can be quiet, systematic and hidden, or because discourse appears to be inevitable and systematic. So in a sense, you know, Foucault began this current emphasis in the linguistic turn, with the emphasis on discourse. In fact, his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France was called The Orders of Discourse, given in 1972. And Said, of course, applying that Foucauldian understanding of discourse, begins to provide an analysis of the literature of the colonial and post-colonial period, really, as a critique of colonial relationships for the first time. So that's the first one. The second one, biopolitical, I should say, is Agamben talking in an interview here, who says quite straightforwardly that he began to apply, he said, I began to apply the same ideological paradigmatic method practiced by Foucault, and while Foucault, I'm paraphrasing here, worked in many areas, two left out were law and theology, and those are the ones that Agamben says he begins to focus on. Because, so this is, if you like, a deficit in Foucault that Agamben tries to follow and to develop. So that's Agamben, and we'll come back to these people in a moment. Radical political economy, then this is Antonio Negri in 2004, where he begins to broach the question of Marxism in Foucault's fierce anti-statism, and he says in Foucault's thought, Marxism is completely dismantled at the level of the analysis of power relations and historical teleology, of the refusal of historicism or a certain kind of positivism. But at the same time, Marxism is also, he says, reinvented and remodeled on the perspective of the movements and struggles, actually on the reality of these subjects, other subjects of these movements and struggles. Because, he says, know is to produce subjectivity. So really, you have a contemporary neo-Marxist interpretation here of Foucault at the global level that goes down the track of plotting the question of subjectivities, multiple subjectivities in relation to capitalism per se. Okay, the synopsis that was in the, I'm not going to read this, but it basically says what I've just said in a much shorter fashion. And I think probably the only thing that I want to mention here is that the synoptic nature of this paper is really to emphasize the hermeneutical gains and losses in following this, and following the postcolonial biopolitics, political, and the empire of capital as three lines of inquiry leading out of Foucault's work, which I see as contemporary, from a contemporary point of view, probably the most promising theoretically, I would argue. And in each case, the field of education opens itself to these new vistas, new problems, new orientations and approaches. So, I think what I want to say in relation to reading and writing after Foucault is to emphasize the concept of a situated reading. Because, you know, it's not a kind of universalist interpretation of Foucault. But we want to say the way we receive texts are really determined by questions of geography, history, culture, as well as the intertext. You know this paper by Foucault, What is an Author? He wrote in 77, referring to Beckett's statement, what matter who's speaking, responding to Barth's rejection of the author as a creator and the proprietor of his work, to emphasize the concept of the author function as a regulator of discourse. So when he goes into studying discourse, he wants to say the author and the author function is one of those internal procedures that regulates the discourse, and that we take for granted. So here, really this concept, this excavation, if you like, of the concept of the author is what he says, this author is a critique of romanticism. It signifies a kind of principle of unity in the process and evolution of writing that neutralizes contradictions in the text. And he goes on to talk about the author as a part of that moment leading to the individualization in the history of ideas, knowledge and literature, or the history of philosophy and science, based on a kind of intentionalist argument about the sovereignty of the author subject as the creator of meaning, as the sole creator of meaning here. And both Roland Barthes and Foucault, but not only them, Philippe Soleur's, Christina and others, in that context, want to begin to critique that intentionalist notion of meaning. But I want to situate the reader in exactly the same kind of genealogical analysis, because I think we can say that the reader is a historical construct, that we can talk about the historical development of publics, of reading publics, that we might begin to understand something more about the relations between materiality and meaning, you know, the industrialization of meaning through the production of the cheap quattro, the changing practice to do with consumption of books and texts, changing practices of print and patronage, the rise of constructivist theories of reading, you know, where reading meaning is, you know, now in some theories resides in a kind of dynamic interplay between the reader and the texts. And of course the digital browser, there's a whole vista that we can open up in this regard. So, thinking of this, I want to suggest there are different kinds of philosophical readings as well. There is a reading which we might say is a programmatic reading. And a programmatic reading really is to say, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses in Foucault? What are the weaknesses in the argument? And how can we expose those weaknesses? Now, I'm not really interested in that kind of reading, that philosophical reading. I want to really develop a reading which is productive. I want to say, what can we extract? What ideas, what major motivating concerns can we use to extend the Foucauldian orientation? How can we use him as he wanted his work to be used as, excuse me, a toolbox and applied to a range of different situations? So this ain't a programmatic reading. It is a dialogical one, and it's a productive one. I want to mine Foucault for the insights that he can give us after, you know, he died in 1984, so after several decades here, what can we say is still useful and applicable in Foucault? So here's the first figure then, postcoloniality. What can we say here, particularly in relation to Edward Said? And we can say, first of all, about such a way of reading to do with postcoloniality. I was very interested in Vaughan Bidoir's presentation this morning, where he was talking about postcoloniality in a New Zealand context, and I know there's some contest over whether that term actually has application, and the way in which postcoloniality in this situation butts up against kind of minority studies, tikanga, and cultural studies paradigms. And Graham reminded me in questions afterwards that what distinguishes that kind of postcoloniality in New Zealand, if you want to use that term, is it as a form of enacted resistance. So it's very much not a discursive so much as a material analysis. I take that lesson, Graham. Thank you for that brief instruction, which was very helpful to me. You know, here, in this case, we can say, you know, here are the inspirations, I guess, the founders of the discourse, the people who developed it and refined it during the 80s and the 90s. I want to talk in this case not just of a discourse, but more dynamically of the life of a discourse that goes through various stages. And at the point where it becomes anthologized, I would say the debate has been drained from the concept, and all that is left in terms of debate is this kind of anthologization. You know, we've got to say, you know, there's a certain kind of unevenness which represents 500 years of colonial history beginning in, you know, let's say roughly 1492, over several centuries, and a discourse over 50 years old, marked by these this late stage of anthologies and collections and readings. So, post-colonial criticism after Foucault. Well, I mentioned this inaugural lecture that Foucault gave on discourse, that actually, not only his inaugural discourse, but it inaugurated in the social sciences, one might say even an obsession with discourse. Everything became discourse. And we had, I don't know, lots of PhD students, I'm not sure what the collective noun is there. When you have a group of PhD students, I'm not going to go down that track, but I'm open to suggestions after the lecture. But when you have lots of people who do discourse analysis, a discourse analysis of this or a discourse analysis of that, well, I mean, one of the major kind of inspirations here is Foucault, who begins to approach the study of discourse through exclusions, through the principles of internal control, conditions of access, and philosophical themes such as the law of discourse as truth, the production of truth, and truth regimes. And if you don't mind me reading this a little bit from the Order of Discourse, in every society, he says, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organised, and redistributed by a certain number of procedures whose role is to ward off its powers and dangers, to gain mastery over its chance events, to evade its ponderous and formidable materiality. Even in English, Foucault's style shines through here. He's a great stylist, and one of the pleasures of reading the text with Foucault is to understand his facility with language. So, appropriating Foucault. Here's Anne Stoller's work. You might know Anne Stoller as a Foucauldian scholar who works in the field of postcoloniality, claimed no single analytic framework has saturated the field of colonial studies so completely over the last decade as that of Foucault. So Foucault's Orientalism, according to Willett, was not only the first attempt to bring the work of Foucault to bear on the process of colonisation, it was also one of the first major texts to take Foucault's work seriously and to render it visible in the Anglophone world. So you get that concept of geography, a geography of reading, of reception, the movement of translation from one language and one continent to another. And post-colonial scholars then have appropriated and transformed this vocabulary provided by Foucault to conceptualize colonialism using a variety of his concepts, governmentality, discourse, and so on. I should say, really, here, Robert Young concluded, this is a sore point, really, and I think we've got to acknowledge it quite openly. Foucault is a Eurocentric thinker. But Robert Young captures this point. Foucault's work displays a virtual absence of explicit discussions of colonialism or race. I think it's true. It's textually true. Despite the discovery of Foucault's comments on race, discussions of colonialism have hardly ever figure in his work. His Mumba, his own theories are Eurocentric in their focus and of limited use in understanding colonial societies. Another viewpoint. I don't have to agree with that. He seemingly ignores the power-knowledge relations between the West and its colonies that provide a logic for determining the kind of global history that we face, we currently face. And this criticism may be pitched, I think, as a critique of Western metaphysical categories that Foucault utilises from Nietzsche and from Heidegger. So, let me say something more about Edward Said's appropriation. I think it only represents one direction not the whole of post-colonial studies. And the criticisms, as I mentioned, are rather, it's not Foucauldian enough or too Foucauldian. There's a relative silence about Foucault's role in post-colonial studies. And I'd say, really, in my reading of it, most of them focus uncritically on the concept of discourse and ignore the rest of Foucault's work, sadly. And when Ibn Said published his landmark study, Orientalism, the adjective post-colonial was still just generally used by historians to designate a kind of period rather than an ethos, rather than a continuing question, rather than a kind of philosophy. Okay, so let me say this, I had some trouble trying to formulate this thought, and I'm open to suggestion on it, but I think there's a kind of paradox at the heart here, because paradoxically, I think given Foucault's neglect of that absolute axis of world history between European powers and colonies over a period of 500 years in many different localities, given his neglect of this, the success of Said's analysis of Orientalism as a discursive formation that creates and regulates the Orient did enable, at that point, say 78, an academic critique of Eurocentrism, colonialism, and imperialism. A kind of, double reflexive circle there. So I'm not going to go through. I don't feel compelled, having put this presentation together, to use all these slides, and you might see me sort of skating over the surface on some of them and refusing to engage with others. But anyway, let me move then to what I want to call discursivity and transcending of the text in relation to the title of the talk. So I make this point, and I don't need to do it again in any great detail, but the productive and dialogical reading rather than a programmatic reading of Foucault. And I emphasize Foucault's own understanding here. He says, of others, he is an example of what he called founders of discursivity. Not of discourse, but of discursivity. As he says of Nietzsche, oh, goodness. Misspelled. I'm slightly dyslexic too, I might say. One of my developmental assets. The other is what they call defiant oppositional syndrome. Defiant oppositional institutional syndrome. Those are my two developmental assets. They've always been so. Here we go. Founders of discourse, as it says of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. So it's both the moral and useful problematique of the author and authorship. And he argues that these founders of discursivity, applied to himself, are unique in that they are not just the authors of their own works. They produce something else. The possibilities and the rules of the formation of other texts. This is what we should try to extract from Foucault after he died. I'm getting some hand signals from my wife that says, for goodness sake, speed up. We're belaboring the point, Michael. Here we go. Postcolonial politics and the empire of capital, then. I think that a dialogical reading of Foucault and postcolonial theory can recognise that Eurocentrism, and yet also see the extraordinary productive analysis of imperial power inspired by Foucault's oeuvre. Okay. I'm going to skate over that one. It's a Wittgensteinian little slide there that would take too long for me to kind of talk about, I think. Let's go to Stoller. So she's saying, 2011 here, security may have become, as Agamben insists, a veritable paradigm of government today.
but it has been paradigmatic and elemental for the practice of imperial government far longer than his assertion suggests. This is having a go at Agamben. It raised an issue that eluded both Foucault's treatment of the carceral archipelago as well as Agamben's treatment of the refugee camp as the first in a series of exceptions, she says, that have become at once the nomos of the modern and the norm, the colony and the camp, are both containments, enclosures, and unsettled encampments that are more closely allied than we may have imagined. And one of the interesting things about discursivity is that it is open to further new interpretations, and we can say new things. I quite like this essay on the education of poor children, the agricultural policies, colonies rather, in 1863. Forms of colonial citizenship, punishment, set of power relations that discipline the colonial body from very early on, as part of the conception of imperial power that shows education as kind of the centre of this colonial process. Oh, the biopolitical. The Foucault's effect in postcolonial studies is uneven. His concept has been used to overcome his own limitations. The emphasis on biopolitics, a new kind of technology of power, different from disciplinary power, marks a kind of theoretical departure that has reinvigorated postcolonial studies and given it a new direction. The colonising state's control over the security of the territory, colonial body, and the life of populations. I think the same is true today, if I can say, writing in an era that I would call the era of digital reason, we face a kind of new governmentality and biopolitics to do with control through national systems. I see Jeff Whitty's here. He knows about these issues in relation to teacher education, the convergence of policies, the PISA internationalisation of global standards that are applied, the confluence of policies and so on. By the way, welcome, Jeff. Nice to have you with us. Biopolitics is a threshold concept. In Lemke, I take this from Lemke, he says the concept of biopolitics here marks the threshold of modernity since it places life at the centre of the political order, and talks about the way in which control is established through the control of the body, the corporeal. Okay. And one might say here that Foucault's concept of biopolitics really begins to function as a critique of the juridico-discursive model of power, the political liberalism, where power is exercised in the framework of law, that the rest of the problematic of sovereignty that has an ultimate say over the right to death. And I think here, in contrast to Foucault, Lemke's arguing, Agamben holds that the modern biopolitics rests on a solid basis of pre-modern sovereign power. So he looks back in law and theology to establish that position, while Hart and Negri, on the contrary, claim that Foucault did not pay sufficient attention to the transformation of a modern to a postmodern biopolitics. Now, I'm more on the side here of Negri and Hart. Again, go back to Agamben here, then he's saying that Foucault's enduring contribution was quite his decisive abandonment of the traditional approach to the problem of power, which is based on the juridical institutional models in favour of an unprecedented analysis of concrete ways in which power penetrates the subject's very bodies and forms of life. You know this from Discipline and Punish, you know this from the Panopticon, you know this from the change in punishment that takes place. You know this from his very concrete studies of the family by his student Jacques Donzelot, and by some of his other students. I must say I'm a little more sceptical again than I am of Negri and Hunt. And I think that if Agamben's work has any relevance to the broad topic of modern education, it is through a theory of biopolitical power, providing that broad historical background against which educational theorists can understand the difference between and transition between these two kind of models. So outside the juridical concept of power, of liberal power, you see a power exercise at the level of the body in a kind of productive micro-physics in prisons and schools and factories that step out, that really is not part of that central liberal juridical conception of power. I'll talk about that again. I think the problem with both Agamben and Foucault here is that the analysis is unrelentingly dark. Connecting a logic of the biopolitical to a state where the elimination of an ethnic minority in the name of national unity bypasses constitutional questions and sovereignty to lead us to a one-way historical street. Well, again, there's no way out of the hidden matrix and nomos of the political architecture in which we still live. I don't think there is in Agamben's view. At least I don't see it in his work. With postmodern biopolitics, Negri here, by contrast, is much more optimistic. It's much more future-oriented. Okay, I think I'm going to get there, Peter. Foucault has, I believe, he says, the extraordinary intuition of defining the shift from modern politics to postmodern biopolitics. But here, he did not manage to comprehend the real dynamics of production in a biopolitical society. And that's really what Negri and Hunt are focused on. They're focused on how new forms of labour and struggle produced by the transformation of material labour into immaterial labour present themselves as producing certain kinds of subjectivity. Let me say, digital, I prefer the term, rather than using the Marxist term of material labour, I want to use digital labour out of that discourse. And I want to say, how and what ways do schools produce digital labour? Under what conditions? For what purpose? As a fundamental biopolitical question. So, and I have 4 minutes, 35 seconds ticking away here in order to come to the grand finale and the grand conclusion here, which I'm going to call reading cybernetic capitalism, where I apply aspects of those readings to understand cybernetic capitalism. I refer to the kind of Italian autonomous tradition that takes its inspiration from Marx and begins to reassert the concept of a global system. If there's anything that we can say about the present, it is that it's ruled by global systems in a new form of kind of extraterritoriality. No longer really based on the nation state, but on these global systems. We talk about Amazon.com, Google, Facebook, with populations now of, 1 billion people, or, to mobile telephony, huge numbers in a global scale. If we thought that we had problems with industrial capitalism in terms of scalability, you ain't seen nothing yet. That's what I would say. The kind of scale that we're talking about here and the implication of that, particularly for education, requires huge examination. This is an essay that I wrote for Thesis 11 a couple of years ago called Bioinformational Capitalism, where I kind of flesh out this. I'm hoping I might get you engaged with that question. It builds on the literatures of biocapitalism and informationalism that Castell calls informational capitalism, to develop this concept, bioinformational capitalism, in order to articulate an emergent form of capitalism that is self-renewing, in the sense that it can change and renew the material basis for life and capital, as well as the program itself.
Right? So this self-renewal, first time in history that capitalism can do this. It's, let's say, it applies and develops aspects of the new biology to informatics to create new organic forms of computing and self-reproducing memory that in turn has become the basis of infobiomatics. I talk about in this paper Craig Venter's discovery of new forms of life. You know, Cynthia, spelled S-Y-T-H, Cynthia, the first new form of created synthetic life that humanity's ever seen, a couple of years ago. You know, it was an equation of amino acids, 3 million letters long, computerized, informatic, that became the DNA placed in a host bacterium that was able to reproduce itself. Definition of new life. Right? That was 2 years ago. So I think that we've got, you know, a new concept here at bioinformation capitalism, which is really different from either Gambin or Negri and Hart, and it's probably less optimistic on the side of political resistance that Hart is. A kind of notion of new organic forms of computing, self-reproducing memory, which I think leads us. I'm not going to talk about cognitive capitalism. I'd love to do that, but I don't have the time. Peter's looking at me here, askance, and I've got to give up the chase here. But basically, let me say here that in the present, the actual right to take life or let life has been replaced not by power to foster life or disallow it upon death, as Foucault argues, but rather by a power that creates and owns new life as material development for the development of the system as a whole. That's the notion of bioinformational politics, biopolitics, that I want to move towards the concept of new social machines, extended minds, collective intelligences, big data and metadata, which increasingly dominate the educational controlled society. And we do move to these new massive global systems of power in this new arrangement. I think that if I stop now, I might be able to take some questions. I hope I can take some questions at this point. No, somebody said no. All right, thank you.